Some laws of magic are never written in textbooks. They are whispered in the dark. This is a story about the thin line where light burns, shadows save, and old hatred becomes the most dangerous form of passion. The rain against the high arched windows of the headmistress's office did not tap. It drummed, a relentless, rhythmic warning that the Scottish autumn had arrived early. Hermione Granger stood with her back to the room, watching the grey sheets of water blur the grounds below. The Black Lake was a churning abyss of charcoal and slate, restless, much like the feeling currently tightening her chest. She smoothed the front of her robes for the third time in as many minutes. The fabric was new, crisp, devoid of the ink stains and frayed hems that had defined her student years. Professor Granger. The title still felt like a borrowed coat, heavy, prestigious, and perhaps a size too large. She took a breath, inhaling the familiar scent of the office, beeswax, old parchment, and the faint, smoky aroma of the fire crackling in the grate. It was the smell of authority. "Please sit, Hermione," Minerva McGonagall said, her voice carrying that peculiar blend of warmth and steel that had terrified and comforted generations of students. "You are pacing a hole in my Persian rug." Hermione turned, offering a tight, apologetic smile as she sank into the chintz armchair opposite the desk. "I'm sorry, headmistress. It's just the syllabus. I've spent the entire summer refining the curriculum for ethics of post-war magic. It's delicate. We're teaching 18-year-olds who have seen more combat than most auras. The balance between theory and trauma is precise, thorough. As always," Minerva interrupted gently. She picked up a porcelain cup, the tea inside trembling slightly, a rare sign of age in the indomitable witch. The Board of Governors was impressed. The Ministry, however, has added a stipulation. Hermione's spine stiffened. The word stipulation rarely preceded good news in the wizarding world. "What kind of stipulation?" "They believe the course requires balance," Minerva said, setting the cup down with a deliberate clink. "You represent the law, the moral high ground, the theoretical framework of magic used for protection and order. But they insist that for the students to truly understand the weight of their choices, they must understand the consequences of the alternative." "The dark arts?" Hermione frowned, her fingers gripping the armrests. "I am perfectly capable of teaching defense, Minerva." "Not defense, Hermione. Application." Minerva's eyes, usually so sharp behind her square spectacles, softened with something akin to pity. They wanted someone with practical experience in the grey areas, someone who understands the cost of magic when it goes wrong, a consultant for the practical seminars. The heavy oak door behind them creaked open. It wasn't a hesitant entrance, nor was it aggressive. It was simply inevitable. Hermione didn't turn immediately. She felt the change in the room's pressure before she saw him. The air grew cooler, charged with a static tension that raised the fine hairs on her arms. A scent drifted past her. Expensive, sterile soap, rain-damp wool, and the bitter undertone of dried sage. "Am I late?" The voice was a low drawl, stripped of its old sneering cadence, but retaining a velvet texture that scraped against Hermione's nerves. The gargoyle was being particularly obstinate about the password. Hermione stood up slowly, turning to face the intruder. Draco Malfoy stood in the center of the room, shaking droplets of rain from a black traveling cloak. He looked older, not in years, but in the way he held himself. The sharp angles of his face, once pointed with aristocratic disdain, were now etched with exhaustion. His hair, longer than she remembered, fell in pale, damp strands across his forehead. He wasn't looking at McGonagall. He was looking at her. His eyes were the colour of the storm outside, grey, impenetrable, and startlingly empty. "Malfoy," she breathed, the name tasting like ash. "Granger," he replied. He didn't sneer. He didn't smirk. He simply acknowledged her existence as a fact he had to endure. He hung his cloak on the rack, revealing a tailored black suit that looked severe, almost funereal. "I assume you've been told the good news." "This is a joke," Hermione said, whipping her head back to McGonagall. "You cannot be serious. He is the practical consultant for an ethics class. The Ministry feels Mr. Malfoy's rehabilitation offers a unique perspective," Minerva said, though she looked as though she'd swallowed a lemon drop that had gone sour. "He is on probation. This position is part of his parole terms. If he fails here, he returns to Azkaban." "Motivating," Malfoy murmured, taking the chair beside Hermione. He sat with a languid grace, crossing one long leg over the other, but Hermione noticed the way his knuckles turned white as he gripped his own knee. "He's a..." Hermione cut herself off, the words Death Eater dying on her tongue. It felt too loud, too violent for the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock. "He represents everything we are trying to teach them not to be." "Precisely," Malfoy said. He turned his head, locking eyes with her. For a moment, the world narrowed to the space between them. Who better to teach them about the rot, Granger, than the apple that fell straight into the mud? "I don't need a cautionary tale," she snapped, her voice rising. "I need a colleague. I need someone who understands the intent behind the spellwork, not just the carnage. Intent is a bedtime story you tell yourself so you can sleep at night," he said softly. The quietness of his voice was far more jarring than if he had shouted. "Magic doesn't care about your intent. It cares about your will. And if these children don't learn the difference between waving a wand and meaning it, they'll blow themselves up before Yule." Hermione stared at him. He looked tired, bone-deep, soul-crushing tired. There were shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and silences too loud to bear. For a fleeting second, her anger faltered, replaced by a jagged curiosity. What had the last 3 years done to him? "I will not let you corrupt my syllabus," she stated, drawing a line in the sand. "And I will not let you get them killed with your idealism," he countered, his gaze unflinching. McGonagall cleared her throat, a sound like a gavel striking wood. "You will coexist. You will cooperate. And you will cohabitate in the staff wing." She pushed a roll of parchment across the desk. "The contract outlines the division of labour. Hermione, you handle the lectures, the history, the legal framework. Draco, you handle the demonstrations, the dueling supervision, and the artifact analysis." Hermione looked down at the parchment. It was dense with legal jargon, but 2 lines stood out at the bottom, one for her signature and one for his. "If either of you breaches the terms, if you endanger a student, or if you fail to deliver a cohesive curriculum, the course is cancelled," Minerva warned. "And frankly, neither of you can afford a professional failure right now." It was true. Hermione needed this tenure to solidify her place in the academic world, to prove she was more than just Harry Potter's friend, and Malfoy. Malfoy needed this to stay out of a cell. She picked up the quill. The feather felt slippery in her damp palm. She signed her name quickly, the letters sharp and angular. Hermione June Granger. She pushed the parchment to him. Malfoy didn't hesitate. He took the quill from her fingers. His hand brushed hers, just the tips of his cold fingers grazing the warmth of her knuckles. A shock, sudden and electric, zipped up her arm. She snatched her hand back as if burned. Malfoy froze, the quill hovering over the paper. He looked at his hand, then at her, his expression unreadable. For a heartbeat, the mask slipped, and she saw something raw in his eyes. Not disgust, but a terrifying awareness. He had felt it too. He lowered his head and signed, Draco Lucius Malfoy. The script was elegant, archaic, and jagged. "Wonderful," McGonagall said, though she sounded exhausted. "Classes begin on Monday. You have the weekend to synchronize your lesson plans. I suggest you start immediately. The library is empty." They were being dismissed. Hermione stood up, gathering her robes, her mind racing with a dozen arguments she hadn't had the chance to make. She walked to the door, her heels clicking loudly on the stone floor. She reached for the heavy iron handle, but a pale hand slammed flat against the wood above her shoulder, holding the door shut. She gasped, spinning around. Malfoy was looming over her, too close. He smelled of rain and cold air. He wasn't touching her, but his proximity was a physical weight. "Let's get one thing clear, Granger," he murmured, his voice rougher now that they were out of McGonagall's direct line of sight. "I don't want to be here. I don't want to teach. And I certainly don't want to spend my evenings arguing ethics with the Golden Girl." "Then leave," she challenged, tilting her chin up to meet his glare. She refused to back down, though her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I can't," he said, and the word was a bleak, hollow thing. "So, since I am trapped in this hell, and you are evidently the warden, do us both a favor." "Which is?" "Don't try to save me," he whispered, his eyes dropping to her mouth for a fraction of a second before snapping back to her eyes. "Stick to your books. Let me handle the monsters. I know them better than you ever will." He pushed the door open for her, stepping back with a mock bow that lacked all humor. Hermione walked out into the corridor, the draft from the spiraling staircase hitting her flushed face. She didn't look back, but she could feel his gaze burning into the space between her shoulder blades. As she descended the stairs, her mind wasn't on the syllabus, or the ministry, or the dangers of the course. It was on the lingering sensation of cold fingers against her skin, and the terrifying realization that the hatred she expected to feel was missing. In its place was something far more dangerous, a magnetic, volatile tension that threatened to pull the very stones of Hogwarts apart. The war was over, but a new battle had just begun. And for the first time in her life, Hermione Granger wasn't sure she had the right weapon to win it. The classroom was situated in the West Tower, a space usually reserved for advanced arithmancy, chosen now for its high ceilings and the vast Gothic windows that allowed the grey Scottish light to spill across the rows of desks. It smelled of chalk dust, old spellbooks, and the collective, nervous sweat of 37th-year students. Hermione Granger stood behind the heavy oak lectern, her posture rigid. She had arranged her notes in a precise grid, aligned with the edge of the wood. To her right, A blackboard displayed a complex diagram of magical velocity and legal intent. To her left, sitting in a darker corner where the shadows seemed to pool unnaturally, was Draco Malfoy. He had not said a word since the students filed in. He sat on the edge of a windowsill, one leg dangling, the other braced against the stone. He was idly spinning his hawthorn wand between his long, pale fingers, over, under, a hypnotic, rhythmic motion that Hermione could see from the corner of her eye. It was distracting. It was deliberate. "Welcome," Hermione began, her voice projecting clearly, though her throat felt tight. "To ethics of post-war magic. This is not a defense against the dark arts class. We are not here to learn how to fight. We are here to learn when not to." A ripple of restless shuffling moved through the room. The students looked tired. These were children who had spent their formative years in a war zone. They didn't want ethics. They wanted armor. "We will begin with the disarming charm," Hermione continued, tapping the diagram on the board with her wand. "In the eyes of the Wizengamot, Expelliarmus is the gold standard of defensive magic. It neutralizes a threat without causing permanent injury. It requires a clear mind and a specific intent to stop, not to harm. The incantation must be precise, the wand movement fluid." "You're boring them, Granger." The voice cut through the lecture like a serrated blade. Hermione froze, her wand tip hovering over a chalk circle. She slowly turned to face the window. Malfoy hadn't moved. He was still watching his own wand spin, his gaze fixed on the wood, as if it held the secrets of the universe. "Excuse me, Professor Malfoy," Hermione said, the title tasting like vinegar. "Do you have something to contribute to the theoretical framework?" Malfoy stopped the spinning wand with a sharp snap of his palm. He looked up, and the class collectively held its breath. His face was pale, the sharp lines of his jaw illuminated by the cold window light. "Theory is fine for the courtroom," he drawled, sliding off the windowsill. His boots made a heavy, ominous sound on the stone floor as he walked slowly toward the center of the room. "But out there, in an alleyway in Nocturne, or in a duel where the other person doesn't care about the Wizengamot, theory gets you buried." He stopped in front of the first row of desks, leaning back against an empty table, crossing his arms. The black fabric of his robes strained slightly across his shoulders. He looked like a predator amidst a flock of startled sheep. "Professor Granger is telling you how to be a good citizen," Malfoy said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried to the back of the room. "I am here to tell you how to stay alive." "The disarming charm saved Harry Potter's life," Hermione countered, her knuckles white as she gripped the lectern. "It ended the war." "It ended the war because the Dark Lord was arrogant," Malfoy shot back, his eyes flashing with a sudden dark fire. He turned his head to look at her, and the intensity of his gaze made her stomach flip. "Do not confuse luck with strategy, Granger. If you disarm an opponent who is truly trying to kill you, do you know what happens next?" "They are neutralized," Hermione insisted. "They summon a second wand," Malfoy said flatly. "Or they pull a knife, or they use wandless magic to collapse your lungs while you're busy congratulating yourself on your moral superiority." The silence in the room was absolute. Even the dust motes seemed to hang suspended in the tension. "Demonstrate," Hermione said. The word left her mouth before she could check it. It was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down on the stone floor. Malfoy's lips quirked up in a ghost of a smirk. Not a happy expression, but one of grim satisfaction. "As you wish, Professor." He pushed off the desk and walked to the open space at the front of the classroom, turning to face her. He stood casually, his arms hanging loose at his sides, his wand held loosely in his right hand. He looked entirely too relaxed. "Disarm me," he said softly. Hermione stepped out from behind the lectern. She felt the eyes of every student on her. She felt the weight of her reputation, the history of their rivalry, the sudden, suffocating intimacy of facing him in a duel. "I am not going to duel you, Malfoy." "It's not a duel," he corrected. "It's a lesson. Cast the charm. Show them the textbook execution. I won't block it." Hermione raised her vinewood wand. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that defied her calm exterior. She looked at him, really looked at him. He was standing with his chest exposed, defenseless, but his eyes were calculating, sharp as flint. "On 3, she said. 1, 2, Expelliarmus." The jet of red light erupted from her wand, perfect and true. It hit Malfoy square in the chest. His hawthorn wand flew from his hand, arching high into the air, spinning away toward the corner of the room. For a fraction of a second, Hermione felt a surge of triumph. The spell had worked. But before his wand even hit the floor, Malfoy moved. It was a blur of motion faster than thought. He didn't scramble for the lost wand. Instead, he lunged forward, closing the 10 feet between them in 2 long strides. Hermione gasped, raising her wand to cast a shield charm, but she was too slow. His left hand, shot out and wrapped around her wrist, twisting it sharply away so her wand pointed harmlessly at the ceiling. In the same fluid motion, he stepped into her space, his body pressing against hers, forcing her back against the chalkboard. The impact drove the air from her lungs. She was pinned. His chest was hard against hers, his hip wedged between hers to prevent her from kicking. His face was inches from her own, so close she could see the flecks of silver in his irises and the faint, jagged scar running into his hairline. He wasn't holding a wand. He was holding her. The class gasped. "Dead," Malfoy whispered. The word brushed against her lips, warm and terrifying. Hermione stared up at him, her breath caught in her throat. Her pulse was roaring in her ears. She could feel the heat of his body through their robes, the iron grip of his fingers on her wrist. He wasn't hurting her, but the control he exerted was absolute. "I'm disarmed," he murmured, his voice low and rough, meant only for her. "My wand is 20 feet away. And yet, I have you pinned. I have control of your wand arm, and if I wanted to, I could snap your neck before you remembered the incantation for Protego." He held her gaze for a second longer, a second that felt like an hour. In that look, there was no hatred. There was a shared, traumatic understanding. He was showing her the world he had lived in, the world where rules didn't matter, only survival did. He released her abruptly, stepping back and smoothing his suit jacket as if nothing had happened. Hermione slumped slightly against the chalkboard, her legs trembling. She clutched her wand, her skin still burning where he had touched her. Malfoy walked over to the corner, picked up his hawthorn wand, and turned back to the stunned class. "The disarming charm is a tool. he addressed the students, his voice bored and clinical again. But it is not a solution. If you take an enemy's weapon, you must immediately assume they are still dangerous. Never hesitate. Never wait to see if they surrender. You cast and then you move. You follow up with a bind, a stun, or... He glanced at Hermione, his eyes dark. You run. He looked back at Hermione. Professor Granger will now explain the legal ramifications of what happens if you panic and use a blasting curse instead. He returned to his windowsill, resuming his perch, spinning his wand again. Over, under, over, under. Hermione straightened her robes. She needed a moment to compose herself, to steady the tremor in her hands. She was furious. She was embarrassed. But beneath the anger, there was a profound unsettlement. She had felt his magic when he touched her. It hadn't felt like the cold, slimy sensation of dark magic she remembered from the war. It had felt like a storm, chaotic, repressed, and overwhelmingly sad. She turned to the class. The students were wide-eyed, looking from her to Malfoy with a new kind of respect. They weren't looking at them as a hero and a villain anymore. They were looking at them as two halves of a very dangerous whole. Turn to page 34, Hermione said, her voice steady, though her cheeks were flushed a deep, dusty pink. Subsection B, excessive force. The scratching of quills filled the silence, but the air in the room had changed. It was charged now, heavy with the scent of ozone and the undeniable tension of unsaid things. Throughout the rest of the lecture, Hermione refused to look at the window. But she could feel him there. She could feel his gaze tracking her every movement, dissecting her words, challenging her intellect. When the bell finally rang, signaling the end of the lesson, the students scrambled to leave, the energy breaking into chatter as soon as they hit the corridor. Hermione began stacking her notes, her movements jerky. She wanted to leave. She wanted to go to the library, to the safety of books that couldn't lunge at her. Granger. She paused, her hands gripping the edge of the parchment. She didn't turn. You made your point, Malfoy. It was theatrical, unnecessary, and physically intrusive. It was effective, he replied. His voice was closer now. He had moved from the window. She turned around. He was standing by the first row of desks, watching her. The arrogance was gone, replaced by that weary, guarded look. You have chalk on your cheek, he said. Hermione instinctively raised a hand to wipe her face, flustered. Thank you. You have good form, he said quietly, almost grudgingly. Your casting speed has improved. I had to learn, she said defensively. We all did. Yes, Malfoy said. He looked down at his hands, inspecting his fingernails. But you learned to fight to save the world. I learned to fight to survive my house guests. The reference to the Death Eaters occupying Malfoy Manor hung in the air between them, a grim spectre. It was an olive branch, wrapped in barbed wire. He was acknowledging his past, acknowledging his trauma in a way he never had before. Same war, Malfoy, she said softly. Different battlefields. He looked up, and for the first time, a genuine, albeit faint expression of surprise crossed his face. He studied her, his grey eyes searching hers for judgment, finding only exhaustion and intellect. The syllabus for next week, he said, shifting the topic abruptly, the walls slamming back up. Counter curses. I want to bring in some cursed objects. Low level, nothing that will eat their faces off. I'll need to inspect them first, Hermione said, regaining her professional footing. And I want a list of the countercurses you plan to demonstrate by Friday. Always the micromanager, he scoffed, but there was no bite in it. He turned to leave, his black cloak swirling around his ankles. Malfoy. He paused at the door, looking back over his shoulder. Next time you want to demonstrate a point, Hermione said, her voice clear and challenging. Warn me, or I might actually hex you. One corner of his mouth lifted, a real smirk this time, sharp, dangerous, and devastatingly attractive. I'm counting on it, Granger. He disappeared into the corridor, leaving Hermione alone in the vast, empty classroom. She let out a breath she felt she had been holding for an hour. She touched her wrist where his fingers had wrapped around it. The skin still tingled, a phantom warmth that refused to fade. She looked at the blackboard, at the neat diagram of ethics and laws. It looked so fragile now. Malfoy was right. The world was messy, violent, and unfair. And if they were going to teach these children to survive it, she realized with a sinking feeling, she couldn't just rely on the light. She was going to have to understand the shadows. And the shadow that had just walked out the door was the most confusing lesson of all. The grandfather clock in the corner of the staff room chimed midnight, the sound heavy and mournful, vibrating through the floorboards. Outside, the Scottish autumn had deepened into a gale. The wind howled around the stone turrets of the castle, a lonely, whistling shriek that made the heavy velvet drapes shudder. Inside, the only light came from the dying embers in the vast hearth and the floating sphere of witchlight hovering above Hermione's desk. She was drowning in parchment. The first round of essays on the moral implications of transfiguration in combat lay in a chaotic sprawl before her. Her eyes burned. Her quill hand cramped. She dipped the nib into the inkwell with a sigh that was more of a groan, scratching a heavy red circle around a paragraph that fundamentally misunderstood the Gamp's law of elemental transfiguration. If you sigh one more time, Granger, I'm going to vanish your entire stack of grading. The voice emerged from the shadows of the wingback armchair near the fire. Hermione didn't jump. She had been acutely aware of his presence for the last 3 hours. Draco Malfoy was effectively invisible in the dim light, save for the pale curve of his hand resting on the armrest and the glint of amber liquid in the crystal tumbler he held. He hadn't moved a muscle since Professor Flitwick had bid them good night at 10. He was staring into the fire, his legs stretched out, his posture one of calculated stillness. If you vanish them, Hermione muttered without looking up, I'll just have to make the students rewrite them, and then we'll both be here until Christmas. A fate worse than death, he drawled. The ice in his glass clinked, a sharp, clear sound in the quiet room. Though, judging by the look on your face, reading their drivel is already killing you slowly. Hermione dropped her quill. It rolled across the parchment, leaving a smear of red ink that looked uncomfortably like blood. She rubbed her temples, pushing back the frizzy escaping strands of her hair. It's not drivel, she defended weakly, though her heart wasn't in it. It's developing minds. They're trying to grasp complex concepts. They're idiots, Malfoy corrected softly. He took a sip of his drink, the firelight catching the sharp line of his throat. I saw the Weasley girl's cousin try to transfigure a tea cozy into a shield during my practical yesterday. He ended up with a woolly mitten that tried to strangle him. A short, startled laugh escaped Hermione's lips before she could stifle it. It was a rusty sound. She covered her mouth instantly, shocked by the betrayal of her own composure. Malfoy turned his head slowly. The firelight illuminated half his face, leaving the other in shadow, a perfect visual metaphor for the man himself. He was looking at her with mild fascination, as if he hadn't realized she was capable of amusement. "You laughed," he accused, his voice low. "It wasn't a laugh," she lied, straightening her spine. "It was a cough of disapproval." "It was a snort, Granger. Don't debase yourself further with lies." He swirled the liquid in his glass. "So, who is the victim of your red ink massacre? Let me guess. Finch Fletchley's nephew? The boy has the magical sensitivity of a brick." Hermione hesitated. The old Hermione, the one who lived for rules and propriety, would have scolded him for speaking ill of a student. But the Hermione sitting in this room, with the wind battering the walls and the ghosts of the war pressing in, was too tired for propriety. "Miss Pusey," she admitted, picking up the parchment. "She argues that it is ethical to transfigure an opponent into a ferret because, and I quote, small mammals are cute and therefore less likely to be attacked by others." Silence stretched between them for a heartbeat. Then Malfoy snorted. It was an ungraceful, genuine sound. He tipped his head back against the chair, looking at the ceiling. A ferret. How original. I wonder where she got that idea. Hermione felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt. The memory of fourth year, Crouch Junior. Bouncing Malfoy around the stone floor was a staple of Gryffindor humor. But sitting here, with the adult version of the boy who had been humiliated, it didn't feel funny. It felt cruel. "I marked it down," she said quietly. "It's dehumanizing magic. That's the point of the lesson." Malfoy lowered his head, his gaze locking onto hers across the room. The amusement vanished, replaced by that familiar, hollow weariness. "Dehumanizing," he repeated, tasting the word. "Yes, that is the specialty of our world, isn't it? Turning people into things, into symbols, into targets." He wasn't talking about transfiguration anymore. Hermione watched him. He looked stripped raw tonight. The arrogance that usually armored him was dissolved by the late hour and the fire whiskey. He looked like a man haunting his own life. "Why are you still here, Malfoy?" she asked, the questions slipping out before she could stop it. "You finished your lesson plans hours ago. You could be in your quarters." "And stare at the ceiling?" He took another drink, a larger swallow this time. "My quarters are in the dungeons. It's quiet down there. Too quiet. At least up here, the wind makes noise." Insomnia. The word hung unsaid between them. Hermione knew it intimately. She knew the way the silence of 3 a.m. could amplify the screams of memory until they were deafening. "I can't sleep either," she confessed. It was an offering, a white flag. Malfoy looked at the empty chair beside him, then back at her. It was a subtle invitation, one that terrified her more than his insults ever had. Slowly, Hermione stood up. Her legs felt stiff. She walked across the Persian rug, the distance feeling miles long. She didn't sit in the chair beside him. That felt too intimate. Instead, she leaned against the heavy oak table near the fire, crossing her arms over her chest, guarding herself. "Is that Ogden's?" she asked, nodding at the bottle on the small table between them. Old fire whiskey, he corrected. From the cellar at the manor, before everything. He picked up the bottle. Do you want a glass? Or is drinking with the enemy a violation of your ethics code? My code is flexible after midnight, she murmured. Malfoy reached for a second tumbler. He had evidently come prepared, or perhaps he just hated drinking alone, and poured 2 fingers of the amber liquid. He didn't levitate it to her. He held it out. Hermione stepped forward and took the glass. Her fingers brushed his, cold against warm, rough callous against smooth skin. A spark, small but sharp, jumped between them again. She pulled back quickly, bringing the glass to her lips to hide her fluster. The whiskey burned pleasantly on its way down, settling as a warm weight in her stomach. It tasted of smoke, peat, and something darker, like burnt sugar. To Miss Pusey, Malfoy toasted, raising his glass with a sardonic twist of his lips. And her tactical ferrets. To the brick-like sensitivity of Mr. Finch-Fletchley, Hermione replied, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. They drank in silence, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer a vacuum. It was a bridge. The students, Hermione said after a moment, staring into the flames. They look at us, and they think they understand. They think the war was a story, a grand adventure where the good guys won and the bad guys lost. They don't know that the good guys are just as broken as the bad guys, Malfoy said softly. They just hide it better under Gryffindor crimson. Hermione looked at him sharply. I am not hiding anything. Aren't you? Malfoy turned in his chair to face her fully. His eyes raked over her. Her messy hair, the ink stain on her finger, the tension in her jaw. You've graded every essay 3 times, Granger. You're obsessing over the syllabus like it's a spell that can fix the past. You think if you just teach them perfectly, if you explain the ethics clearly enough, you can prevent the next Voldemort. It's my job, she whispered. It's your penance, he countered. Just like this job is mine. I'm here because the Ministry thinks I'm a danger. You're here because you're terrified that if you stop working, you'll have to actually feel something. The truth of his words struck her like a physical blow. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. Hot, angry tears. She hated him for seeing her. She hated him for being right. You don't know me, she said, her voice trembling. I've watched you for 7 years, he said. I watched you bleed on my drawing room floor. The air left the room. Hermione's grip on her glass tightened until her knuckles were white. The memory of Bellatrix's knife, the chandelier, the screaming, it all rushed back, visceral and suffocating. I didn't do anything, Malfoy whispered. His voice was cracked, stripped of all defenses. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was staring into his glass as if looking for salvation in the dregs. I stood there, and I watched, and I did nothing. It was a confession. It was the rot at the center of him, finally exposed to the air. Hermione's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at the man in the chair, the Prince of Slytherin, the bully, the Death Eater. He looked small. He looked like a boy who had been given a choice between murder and death, and had chosen a slow suicide of the soul. She could leave. She could walk out and leave him to his misery. But she didn't. She took a step closer, then another, until she was standing directly in front of his chair. You're doing something now, she said. Her voice was steady, surprising even herself. Malfoy looked up. His eyes were wide, unguarded, silver pools of shock. "You saved that boy yesterday," she said. "When the hex backfired, you moved before I even saw it. You didn't think. You just acted." "Reflex," he dismissed, looking away. "No," Hermione said firmly. She set her glass down on the table with a decisive clink. "Intent. You told the class intent doesn't matter, but you were wrong. Your intent was to save him." She reached out, her hand hovering for a moment, before she laid it gently on his shoulder. The contact was tentative, light as a feather, but he flinched as if she had branded him. He didn't pull away. He sat frozen, his breath hitching in his chest. "We can't fix what happened, Draco," she said, using his given name for the first time. The sound of it felt strange on her tongue, intimate and forbidden. "But we can teach them to be better than we were. That's not penance. That's just hope." He looked at her hand on his shoulder, then up at her face. His expression was a kaleidoscope of emotions, confusion, longing, and a deep, profound sadness. "Hope," he scoffed, but the sound lacked its usual bite. "A dangerous thing, Granger." "I know," she whispered. She held his gaze for a long moment. In the flickering firelight, the lines of enmity that had defined them for a decade seemed to blur. They weren't Gryffindor and Slytherin. They were just two survivors in a drafty castle, trying to keep the cold out. Hermione slowly withdrew her hand. The loss of contact left a cold spot on her palm. "Good night, Malfoy," she said softly. She turned and walked toward the door. She didn't look back, but as she reached for the handle, his voice stopped her. "Hermione." She paused. He hadn't called her Granger. "Leave the essays," he said, his voice rough. I'll look over the practical applications in them. You're going to burn yourself out." A small, genuine smile touched her lips. She didn't turn around, afraid to break the fragility of the moment. "Thank you, Draco." She slipped out into the corridor, the heavy door clicking shut behind her. The hallway was cold, but for the first time in months, Hermione felt a spark of warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the whiskey. Inside the room, Draco Malfoy stared at the door. He reached up, his fingers brushing the spot on his shoulder where her hand had rested. He closed his eyes, exhaling a breath he felt he had been holding since he was 16 years old. The storm outside raged on, but the storm inside had, for a brief moment, found a center. The restricted section of the Hogwarts library breathed. It was a slow, dusty respiration, the exhalation of thousands of books that had not been opened in decades. The air here was colder than the rest of the castle, heavy with the metallic tang of preservation charms and the faint, rotting sweetness of decaying leather. Hermione Granger adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, her wand raised high. The tip glowed with a soft, steady light, cutting a cone of visibility through the gloom. Shadows danced wildly against the towering shelves, stretching and twisting like silent spectres. "You're walking too loud, Granger." The whisper came from behind her, close enough to ruffle the stray curls escaping her bun. Hermione didn't startle this time. She was becoming accustomed to the way Draco Malfoy moved, like smoke, like a shadow detaching itself from the wall. "I am walking at a normal volume," she whispered back, though she instinctively lightened her step. "And we have permission to be here. Minerva signed the pass." "The books don't care about permission," Malfoy murmured, stepping up beside her. The pale light of her wand illuminated the sharp planes of his face. He looked focused, his eyes scanning the spines of the books with a hunter's intensity. Some of these tomes, they wake up if you make too much noise, and they get hungry. Hermione shivered, pulling her robes tighter around herself. She knew he wasn't joking. They were here to select an artifact for the midterm practical exam, something dangerous enough to test the students' reflexes, but stable enough not to kill them. It was a delicate balance. "We need something cursed," she said, consulting the list floating in the air before her. Class C, object-bound hexes, compulsion charms, or sensory disruption. "Boring," Draco drawled. He reached out, his long fingers trailing over the cracked spine of venomous magics of the 15th century. He didn't touch the leather, hovering just millimeters above it, sensing the residual magic. "If you want to test them, give them something that lies." "We are not giving them a cursed object that lies, Draco. They are barely passing the theory." "Then they'll fail," he said simply. He moved deeper into the aisle, the darkness swallowing him. "Found it." Hermione followed him. He had stopped in front of a narrow, iron-barred cabinet at the very end of the row. Inside, resting on a velvet cushion that had long since turned to dust, was a silver filigree music box. It was beautiful, delicate, and entirely unassuming. "A music box?" Hermione raised an eyebrow. "What does it do? Play bad opera until their ears bleed?" "It plays a lullaby," Draco said quietly. He raised his wand, murmuring a complex unlocking charm. The iron bars groaned and clicked open. "And while you listen, it slowly calcifies your lungs. You turn to stone from the inside out. Peaceful, quiet, lethal." "Draco!" Hermione hissed, stepping back. "We cannot use that." "We can if I modify the curse," he said, ignoring her panic. He reached into the cabinet. "Don't touch it!" He didn't listen. He never listened. Hermione watched, breath held, as Draco slid his hands into the cabinet. He wasn't wearing dragon-hide gloves. He wasn't using levitation. He was using his bare hands. But as his fingers brushed the silver metal, she saw it. A faint, shimmering distortion around his skin. A localized containment field, cast wandlessly, so thin it was almost invisible. It was a piece of magic so precise, so difficult, that most auras couldn't perform it. He lifted the box. The silver gleamed malevolently in the wand light. "Relax, Granger," he said, turning to face her. The box sat in his palm, harmless as a paperweight under his control. "I learned to handle these when I was 7. My Aunt Bellatrix used to leave cursed trinkets around the manor to test my reflexes." The casual horror of the statement hung in the silence. Hermione stared at him. She saw the way his jaw was set, the absolute stillness of his hands. He wasn't showing off. He was simply existing in the only way he knew how, by dominating the danger before it could dominate him. "That's barbaric," she whispered. "That's childhood," he corrected, his voice devoid of self-pity. "Now, hold this." "What?" "Hold the light. Steady. I need to dampen the frequency of the curse so it only causes temporary paralysis, not permanent petrification." Hermione stepped closer. She raised her wand higher, the light flooding the small space between them. They were cocooned in the dark aisle, surrounded by hostile books, focused on the small silver object in his hand. Draco took his own wand out. He began to weave a counterspell, the tip of his wand moving in intricate, microscopic spirals over the box. He was murmuring the incantations under his breath, a low, rhythmic chanting in Latin that sounded more like a prayer than a spell. Hermione watched his face. His eyelashes were long, casting shadows on his cheekbones. His brow was furrowed in concentration. There was a bead of sweat near his temple. He was beautiful. The thought struck her with the force of a stunning spell. It wasn't the shallow appreciation of his looks she might have had as a teenager. It was an appreciation of his competence, his focus, the terrifying grace with which he handled something that could kill him. It was the beauty of a storm or a weapon. She realized with a sudden, sinking feeling that she wasn't just tolerating him anymore. She was fascinated by him. "Draco," she breathed. "Focus, Hermione," he snapped, but he used her first name. "Almost there. I have to untie the knot in the enchantment." He shifted his grip on the box. His shoulder brushed hers. The contact was electric, searing through the layers of their robes. Hermione didn't pull away. She leaned in, drawn by the gravity of his magic. "There," he exhaled. A soft click echoed from the box. The sinister aura surrounding it faded, replaced by a dull, dormant hum. "It's safe?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Safe is a relative term," he said, lowering his wand. He looked up, and he seemed to realize for the first time how close they were. They were inches apart. The light from her wand illuminated the specks of gold in his grey eyes. She could smell him, the scent of old parchment, the sharp tang of ozone from the spellwork, and beneath it all, the warm, clean scent of his skin. The air in the library seemed to thicken, becoming viscous and hard to breathe. The tension that had been simmering between them for weeks suddenly boiled over, transforming from academic rivalry into something raw and physical. Draco didn't move away. He stared at her mouth, his gaze dark and hungry. "You have too much faith in books," he whispered. It was a non sequitur, a desperate attempt to keep the conversation on safe ground, but his voice betrayed him. It was rough, scraping against her nerves. "And you have too little," she replied, her voice barely audible. "Books can't save you from this," he murmured. He shifted, turning his body fully toward her. The music box was still in his hand, forgotten. His free hand twitched at his side, as if he wanted to reach out, to touch her, to bridge the final inch between them. Hermione's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Do it!" a treacherous voice in her head whispered. "Touch him." She lowered her wand slightly, the shadows rushing in to embrace them. "From what?" she asked. "From the fact that you're standing in the dark with a former Death Eater," he said, his words bitter but his eyes pleading. "And you're not running away." "I'm not afraid of you," she said firmly. "I haven't been afraid of you for a long time." "You should be." He took a step closer, crowding her against the shelf behind her. It wasn't threatening. It was magnetic. He radiated a heat that she craved. She could feel his breath on her face, warm and erratic. "Why?" she challenged, tilting her head back to look him in the eye. "Because," he whispered, leaning down until his lips were hovering just beside her ear. "I want to ruin you, Granger. I want to take all that perfect, orderly logic of yours and shatter it until you're just as messy as the rest of us." The words sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. It was a confession of desire wrapped in a threat. Hermione turned her head, her nose brushing against his jawline. The stubble was rough against her skin. "Maybe I want to be ruined," she breathed. Draco froze. The air left his lungs in a sharp hiss. For a moment, she thought he would kiss her. The anticipation was an agony, a tight coil in her stomach waiting to spring. She saw his hand raise, his fingers hovering near her waist, trembling. Then, a loud thump echoed from the other end of the aisle. A book had fallen from a shelf. The spell broke. Draco flinched back as if he had been burned. The mask slammed back down over his face, cool, indifferent, aristocratic. He stepped away, putting 3 feet of distance between them in a heartbeat. "The box is ready," he said, his voice clipped and cold. He shoved the silver object into her hands, avoiding her fingers. "Don't wind it past 3 turns. Unless you want the students to nap for a week." He turned on his heel, his cloak swirling around him, and strode away into the darkness. "Draco!" she called out, clutching the cold metal box to her chest. He didn't stop. "I'll see you in class, Professor Granger." Hermione stood alone in the dark aisle, the silence of the library rushing back in to fill the space he had left. Her heart was still racing, her skin flushing hot. She looked down at the cursed music box in her hands. It was heavy, dangerous, beautiful, just like him. She sank against the bookshelf, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. She pressed the back of her hand to her lips, which were tingling as if he had kissed her. The line had been crossed. They weren't just colleagues anymore. They weren't just enemies. They were 2 people standing on the edge of a precipice, staring down into the abyss. And for the first time, Hermione wasn't sure she wanted to step back. She wanted to jump. She pushed off the shelf, pocketing the box. As she walked back toward the exit, the library felt different. The shadows didn't look like monsters anymore. They looked like hiding places. The midterm was approaching. But the real test, she realized, had nothing to do with the students. It was happening right here, in the silence between her heartbeats, where the image of Draco Malfoy's grey eyes burned brighter than any lumos. She extinguished her wand, letting the darkness take her, and for the first time in years, she smiled a secret, dangerous smile. The air in the classroom tasted like ozone and burnt sugar, the distinct olfactory signature of high-energy magic. It was Thursday afternoon, the slot designated for applied defensive theory, and the room was vibrating with the collective focus of 28 exhausted but exhilaratingly competent students. Hermione moved through the rows of desks, her robes swishing softly against the stone floor. She felt a profound, quiet satisfaction. Over the last month, the chaos of the first week had settled into a rhythm. A dangerous rhythm, perhaps, but a functional one. "Elbow up, Mr. Finnegan," she corrected gently as she passed Seamus's younger cousin. "If you drop your arm, the shield charm collapses at the bottom. You're protecting your head, but leaving your knees exposed to a leg locker curse." "Like this, Professor?" the boy asked, adjusting his stance. "Better?" Hermione smiled. Across the room, Draco Malfoy was running a drills gauntlet. He moved like a metronome, snapping instructions with a crisp, dry authority that had somehow, miraculously, garnered the students' respect rather than their fear. "Again," Malfoy ordered, watching a Ravenclaw girl attempt a disillusionment charm. "You're shimmering. If I can see the air bending around you, a werewolf can definitely see you. Magic requires conviction, Miss Turpin. You aren't asking the light to bend, you are commanding it." He caught Hermione's eye across the room. Just a glance. a fraction of a second where their gazes locked over the heads of the students. There was no sneer, no challenge, just a nod, a silent acknowledgement of a shared success. "We are doing this," the look said. "We are actually doing this." Hermione felt a flush of warmth that had nothing to do with the heating charms in the room. They had built this. The syllabus, the drills, the tentative trust that held the class together. It was theirs. The late nights in the library, the whiskey by the fire, the tension that hummed between them like a live wire. It had all culminated in this functioning machine. "All right," Malfoy called out, clapping his hands once. The sound cracked through the room like a whip. "Enough defense. Let's move to containment. The binding jinx, Incarcerus." The class shuffled, eager. This was active magic. "Partner up," Hermione instructed, stepping up to the dais. "Remember the theory we discussed on Tuesday. The rope is a manifestation of your will to restrain. It is not a weapon to crush, it is a tool to hold. Mr. Boot, you're up." Malfoy pointed to a tall, confident boy in the front row. "Demonstrate on the dummy. Clean cast. 3 seconds to bind." Terry Boot's younger brother, confident and perhaps a bit arrogant, stepped forward. He flipped open his textbook, the standardized ethics and application text that Hermione and Draco had spent weeks compiling. Their handwriting mingled in the margin notes of the master copy. "Page 102, the boy muttered, checking the wand movement. He raised his wand, narrowed his eyes at the straw dummy standing 10 feet away, and shouted, "Incarcerus!" It happened in a heartbeat. The spell didn't produce the thick hempen ropes that usually spiraled from the wand tip. Instead, a jet of oily black liquid erupted from the boy's wand. It didn't fly straight. It lashed out like a living thing, a jagged whip of darkness that screamed as it cut through the air. It didn't hit the dummy. It veered wild, seeking heat, seeking life. It struck the girl standing next to the target, a Hufflepuff named Rose. The black substance wrapped around her throat instantly. It wasn't rope. It was a solidifying shadow, a constricting tar that hissed as it tightened. Rose's hands flew to her neck, her eyes bulging, her mouth opening in a silent scream as the air was cut off. "Rose!" someone shrieked. Hermione froze for a millisecond, her mind unable to process the anomaly. That wasn't Incarcerus. That was dark magic. Vicious, suffocating dark magic. "Move!" Draco was already moving. He didn't run. He blurred. He vaulted over a desk, landing between the panicked students and the choking girl. Hermione raised her wand. "Finite incantatum!" she cried, putting her full power behind the counterspell. The red light hit the black tar and fizzled out like a match in a rainstorm. The curse didn't even shudder. It tightened. Rose's knees buckled. Her face was turning a terrifying shade of violet. "It's not a charm!" Draco shouted, his voice raw with panic. "It's a strangulation hex! Back away! Everyone back!" He grabbed Rose by the shoulders, holding her upright as she thrashed. He looked at the black substance, his eyes widening in recognition. Hermione saw the blood drain from his face. He knew this magic. "Draco, do something!" Hermione screamed, terror gripping her heart with icy fingers. Draco raised his hawthorn wand, pointing it not at the girl, but at his own hand. He slashed the air, a violent, jagged movement. "Secer tenebris!" he roared. A blade of silver light, sharp as a scalpel, severed the black cord. The darkness shrieked, a high human sound that made Hermione's blood run cold, and dissolved into a pile of ash on the floor. Rose collapsed, gasping, sucking in great heaving gulps of air. Her neck was bruised purple, a perfect ring of trauma where the magic had held her. The room was deathly silent. The only sound was the girl's weeping and the harsh, ragged breathing of Draco Malfoy. He stood over her, his chest heaving, his wand hand trembling violently. He stared at the pile of ash, his expression one of utter horror. "Class dismissed," Hermione said. Her voice was a whisper, but it carried. "Everyone out. Now. Mr. Boot, leave your wand on my desk. Go." The students didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled for the door, pale and shaken, casting terrified glances at the ash, at Rose, and, most significantly, at Draco. When the last robe had fluttered out of the room and the door slammed shut, the silence that descended was heavy enough to crush bones. Hermione rushed to Rose, checking her pulse, casting a quick diagnostic charm. "She's in shock, and the bruising is severe, but the airway is clear. I need to get her to the hospital wing." "Go," Draco said. He hadn't moved. He was staring at the floor. "I'll stay here. I'll secure the room." Hermione hesitated. She looked at him. He looked shattered. The mask was gone, replaced by the terrified boy she remembered from the astronomy tower. "Draco," she began, but she didn't know what to say. "Take her, Hermione," he snapped, flinching as if struck. Hermione levitated the sobbing girl and hurried out of the room. But as she walked down the corridor, her mind wasn't on the hospital. It was on the spell, the black tar, the scream. She dropped Rose off with Madame Pomfrey, giving a breathless explanation, and sprinted back to the classroom. Her heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Please," she thought, "please don't let it be him." When she burst back into the classroom, Draco was standing at the lectern. He had the textbook open, Mr. Boot's copy. He was staring at it, his face grey in the fading afternoon light. He looked up when she entered. His eyes were haunted. "Tell me you didn't teach him that," Hermione said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a plea. She needed him to deny it. She needed him to be innocent. "I didn't," Draco whispered. He pushed the book toward her. "Look." Hermione walked to the lectern. Her hands were shaking as she looked down at the open page. The binding jinx, incarcerus. Movement, a sweeping figure 8. Incantation, incarcerus. It looked normal, perfectly normal. "Read the footnote," Draco said, his voice tight. Hermione squinted. At the bottom of the page, in the small print explaining the intent visualization, the text had been subtly altered. "Visualize the constriction of the airway to ensure immobility." "That's not what we wrote," Hermione breathed, clutching the edge of the lectern. "We wrote, visualize the restriction of movement, not the airway. And the wand movement." Draco pointed a shaking finger at the diagram. "Look at the loop. It's not a figure 8. It's broken at the top. That's not the binding jinx, Hermione. That's the Vipera variation. It's a torture curse used by my father's circle." Hermione stared at the page. The ink looked identical to the rest of the text. It was a perfect forgery, a magical alteration so subtle that a student wouldn't notice. But the intent was lethal. "Someone changed the books," she said, the realization settling in her stomach like a stone. "Not just the notes, the actual textbooks. Only the teachers have access to the master copying charm," Draco said. He stepped back from the book as if it were radioactive. Only you and me. The silence stretched between them, thin and brittle. Hermione looked at him. He was standing in the shadows, his black suit blending into the gloom. He looked dangerous. He looked like the person everyone warned her he was. "Draco," she said slowly, "you knew the counter-curse. Instantly." "Because I've seen it cast," he shouted, his composure shattering. "Because I watched people die from it on my dining room table. That's why I knew it." "But how did it get in the book?" Hermione asked, her voice trembling. "You handled the practical revisions. You approved the diagrams." Draco went still. His eyes went cold, the shutters slamming down over his soul. He saw the doubt in her eyes. He saw the logic working behind her gaze. Draco Malfoy, former Death Eater, specialist in dark arts, suddenly teaching dangerous curses to students. "You think I did it," he said flatly. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to," he laughed, a bitter, jagged sound. "It's the logical conclusion, isn't it? The scorpion stings the frog. The Death Eater tries to kill the mudblood students." "Stop it!" Hermione slammed her hand onto the desk. "I am trying to think. If you didn't do it and I didn't do it, then someone else has access to our materials. Someone who wants to hurt the students, or someone who wants to frame you." Draco stared at her. The anger drained out of him, leaving him looking incredibly young and incredibly tired. "Frame me," he whispered. "Hermione, look at the board. Look at the ministry. They're waiting for me to slip. If they see this, if they see a student almost strangled by a spell I was supervising from a book I approved, they'll send you back to Azkaban," she finished for him. "Tonight," he said. "They'll come for me tonight." He turned away, walking toward the window. The sun had set, leaving the sky a bruised purple. "I should pack," he said to the glass. Hermione watched his back. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the resignation in his posture. He was giving up. He was accepting the narrative the world had written for him. She felt a surge of fierce, protective anger. Not at him. For him. She walked around the desk and grabbed his arm, spinning him around. He looked surprised, his eyes wide. "You are not packing," she said, her voice fierce. "And you are not going to Azkaban." "Hermione, the evidence is tampering," she cut him off. "It's sabotage, and we are going to prove it." "We?" Draco looked at her hand on his arm. "You should be reporting me. That's the ethical thing to do. That's what Professor Granger would do." "Screw ethics," Hermione hissed. Draco blinked. "Someone used my class to hurt a child," she said, her eyes blazing with a terrifying intensity. "Someone tainted my work, and someone is trying to take my partner away." She tightened her grip on his arm. "I don't care about the rules right now, Draco. I care about the truth, and I know you didn't do this." "How?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "How can you know? I'm me." "Because," Hermione said, her voice softening. She reached up with her other hand, hesitantly touching his cheek. His skin was cold, but he leaned into the touch, closing his eyes. "Because I saw you with the music box. I saw you with the essays. And I saw you today. You didn't hesitate. You saved her." She took a breath, stepping closer until they were sharing the same air. "I trust you," she whispered. The words hung in the air, more powerful than any spell. Draco opened his eyes. They were wet. He looked at her with a mixture of awe and devastation. He raised his hand, covering hers where it rested on his cheek. He pressed her palm against his skin, as if trying to absorb her belief in him. "You're a fool, Granger," he choked out. "I'm the brightest witch of my age," she corrected softly. "I'm rarely wrong." He let out a shaky breath, turning his face to press a kiss to the center of her palm. It was a gesture of fealty, of desperation, of love terrified to speak its name. "Okay," he whispered against her skin. "Okay, so what do we do?" Hermione lowered her hand, her pulse racing from the sensation of his lips. She turned back to the sinister textbook lying on the lectern. "We find the glitch," she said, her eyes hard and calculating. "We find who altered the ink, and we bury them." She looked back at him. "But first, we have to hide the body." Draco raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "The book," she clarified, grabbing the forged text. "We can't let the Ministry see this copy. If they see it, the investigation starts and you're gone. We need to hide it, replace it with a clean copy for the records, and investigate it ourselves." "That's obstruction of justice," Draco said, a slow, incredulous smile spreading across his face. "That's illegal, Granger." Hermione tucked the book into her robes. She looked him dead in the eye, and for the first time, Draco saw the ruthless edge that had helped Harry Potter survive a war. "It's not illegal if we don't get caught," she said. "Now, are you coming, or are you just going to stand there looking pretty?" Draco laughed. It was a short, shocked sound, but it was real. He shook his head, looking at her as if he had never seen her before. "I'm coming," he said. He walked to her side. As they left the classroom, leaving the scent of ozone and fear behind them, their hands brushed. This time, neither of them pulled away. Their fingers hooked together, a silent pact in the darkness. The storm had broken in the classroom, but a bigger one was coming, and for the first time, they were facing it in the same direction. The corridors of Hogwarts, usually a labyrinth of warmth and whispering portraits, had transformed into a sterile, echoing tunnel of judgment. The stone walls seemed to lean in, cold and damp, pressing against Hermione's shoulders as she walked toward her office. It was barely dawn. The castle was asleep, save for the two of them and the man waiting inside. Walter Vane, senior investigator for the Department of Magical Education, was not a man who enjoyed magic. He enjoyed order. He sat behind Hermione's desk, as if he owned it, his hands folded over a thick file, his face a mask of bureaucratic indifference. Draco Malfoy stood by the window, his back to the room. He was staring out at the grey, churning sky, his posture rigid. He wore his black suit like armour, buttoned high, his silhouette sharp against the morning light. He hadn't looked at Hermione since they received the summons an hour ago. He was already gone, she realized with a pang of terror. He had mentally checked out, retreated into the occluded fortress of his mind where no one could hurt him. He was preparing for the sound of the cell door closing. "Professor Granger," Vane said, his voice dry as parchment. He didn't stand up. "Please, shut the door. We have a discrepancy to discuss regarding the incident with Miss Zeller yesterday." Hermione closed the heavy oak door. The click of the latch sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. She walked to the chair opposite the desk, but didn't sit. She stood tall, her hands clasped in front of her to hide their trembling. "It was an accident, Mr. Vane," Hermione said, her voice steady. A stress response from a student pushing her magical core too hard. We have already adjusted the syllabus to include more meditation breaks. An accident, Vane repeated, opening the file. He pulled out a sheet of parchment, a copy of the incident report filed by the hospital wing. Madame Pomfrey treated the girl for constrictive trauma consistent with dark magic, specifically a variation of the Vipera stranglehold. Draco's shoulders tensed, but he didn't turn. And, Vane continued, his eyes sliding toward Draco's back, we have received an anonymous tip that the practical instruction for that particular lesson was altered, that the students were encouraged to visualize violence. Hermione's heart hammered against her ribs. The anonymous tip. It had to be whoever tampered with the books. They were closing the net. "Mr. Malfoy," Vane said sharply. Draco turned slowly. His face was a blank canvas, his eyes devoid of light. "Sir, you are the instructor for practical application," Vane said, tapping a quill against the desk. "You are also a convicted felon on probation, with a known history of utilizing this specific branch of magic. Did you instruct the students to alter the binding jinx?" "I did not," Draco said flatly. "Then how do you explain the girl's injuries, or the fact that the spellcast was not incarcerous, but something far more malicious?" Vane's voice dropped, becoming silky and dangerous. "Did you write the lesson plan for Thursday, Mr. Malfoy?" This was it. The trap. If Draco said yes, he was admitting to writing the curriculum that caused the injury. If he said no, he would have to explain who did, and the investigation would turn to the tampered books. Books they had hidden. Books that had his magical signature all over the revision charms. Draco looked at Vane, then for the first time he looked at Hermione. His eyes were screaming. "Let me go! Save yourself! Tell him it was me!" He opened his mouth. I wrote it," Hermione interrupted. The silence that followed was absolute. Vane blinked, his bureaucratic mask slipping for a fraction of a second. Draco's head snapped toward her, his expression shattering into shock. "Excuse me?" Vane asked. "The lesson plan," Hermione said, stepping forward. She forced herself to sound arrogant, the insufferable know-it-all she had been at 12. "It was my design. I was attempting to deconstruct the incarcerous spell to show the students its arithmetic roots. I theorized that by slightly altering the wand movement, the open loop at the apex, we could increase the tensile strength of the ropes." She picked up a quill from the desk and drew a diagram in the air, speaking fast, burying him in jargon. "I failed to account for the ambient magical resonance in the West Tower," she lied smoothly. "The open loop interacted with the residual defensive wards, inverting the charm's intent from bind to constrict. It was a theoretical error, a miscalculation in the arithmancy of the spell structure." She looked Vane dead in the eye. "It was my mistake, investigator. Mr. Malfoy merely followed my instructions. He actually saved the student when my theory proved volatile." Vane stared at her. He looked from her earnest, fierce face to Draco's stunned silence. "You are claiming," Vane said slowly, "that Hermione Granger, war heroine and brightest witch of her age, made a calculation error that resulted in dark magic." "I am claiming that experimental magic is dangerous," Hermione said, lifting her chin, "and that I am human. Unless the Ministry suggests that I did it on purpose." It was a dare. She was throwing her entire reputation, her Golden Girl status, her Order of Merlin, her friendship with Harry Potter, onto the scale. She was daring him to accuse her of malice. Vane looked at her for a long, tense moment. He couldn't do it. He couldn't arrest Hermione Granger for an accident. It would be a PR nightmare. Arresting Draco Malfoy, the ex-Death Eater, would have been easy, convenient. But Hermione? Vane closed the file with a snap. "A theoretical error," he said, his voice tight with disappointment. "Very well. A formal reprimand will be placed on your file, Professor Granger, and the Board of Governors will be reviewing your syllabus for the remainder of the term. One more incident. One, and this course is cancelled, and you will both be facing an inquiry." He stood up, smoothing his robes. He looked at Draco with a sneer. "You are lucky, Malfoy. Very lucky that your colleague is so clumsy." Vane walked to the door. "Good day." The door closed. The silence that rushed back into the room was deafening. Hermione let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for 10 minutes. Her knees turned to water, and she had to grip the edge of the desk to keep from falling. "You idiot." The voice was a low growl. Hermione looked up. Draco had crossed the room in 2 strides. He wasn't looking at her with gratitude. He was looking at her with a terrifying, blazing fury. "What did you do?" he hissed, gripping her shoulders. His fingers dug into her robes, shaking her slightly. "You lied to the Ministry. You took the blame. Do you have any idea what you just did to your career, to your reputation?" "I saved my partner," Hermione whispered, staring up at him. "You saved a convict," Draco shouted, his voice cracking. "I am expendable, Hermione. That is the point. I am the one who is supposed to take the fall. You are Hermione Granger. You are the future of this world. You don't throw yourself in the mud for someone like me." "I decide who I am," she snapped, her own anger flaring to meet his. She shoved his hands off her shoulders. "And I decide who is worth saving. Don't you dare tell me I made a mistake." "It was a mistake." He ran a hand through his hair, pacing away from her, then spinning back. He looked frantic, his composure utterly destroyed. "They were looking for a reason to burn me. I was ready. I had my bag packed. Why didn't you let them take me?" "Because you didn't do it," she shouted. "Because it's not just about you anymore, Draco. It's about us. It's about the work." "The work?" He laughed, a wild, hysterical sound. He closed the distance again, backing her up until her hips hit the desk. He loomed over her, his grey eyes storms of conflict. "Do you think I care about the bloody syllabus? I care about you. I can't watch you destroy yourself for me. I've watched too many people die for the wrong reasons. I won't let you be a casualty of my life." "I am not a casualty," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. She reached out, grabbing the lapels of his jacket, pulling him down to her level. "I am your accomplice." The word hung between them. Accomplice. Draco stared at her. His breathing was ragged, his chest heaving against hers. The anger in his eyes began to morph into something else, something desperate and consuming. "Why?" he breathed. "Why would you do that?" "Because I know who you are," she said. Tears pricked her eyes, blurring the sharp lines of his face. "I know you're not the boy who watched from the shadows anymore. I know you're the man who stays up until 3 a.m. grading essays to save me time. I know you're the man who saved Rose. And I couldn't let them take you." Draco's resistance crumbled. The walls he had built around himself, the walls of self-hatred and martyrdom, shattered under the weight of her absolute faith. He made a sound, half sob, half groan, and his hands came up to cup her face. His thumbs traced her cheekbones, his touch trembling. "You are the most infuriating, brilliant, reckless witch I have ever met," he whispered. "And you are a terrible liar," she retorted softly. He looked at her mouth. The tension that had been building for months, the arguments, the late nights, the touches in the library, the shared trauma, finally snapped. Draco lowered his head and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It was the taste of fear and relief and whiskey and rain. His lips were hard against hers, demanding, desperate. He kissed her like a drowning man finding air, like a man on death row who had just been given a pardon. Hermione made a whimpering sound in her throat and wound her arms around his neck, pulling him closer. She opened to him, meeting his intensity with her own. She tasted the salt of his skin, felt the frantic beat of his heart against her chest. He lifted her, swinging her up onto the edge of the desk, stepping between her knees to get closer. His hands were everywhere, in her hair, gripping her waist, tangling in her robes. He needed to feel that she was real, that she was here, that he hadn't lost her. "Hermione," he gasped against her mouth, breaking the kiss for a heartbeat. "Hermione, if they find out—" "They won't," she whispered, pulling him back down. "We'll find the person who did this. We'll fix it." "I can't let you fall with me," he murmured, resting his forehead against hers. His eyes were closed, his lashes wet. "Then don't let go," she said. Draco opened his eyes. The grey was dark, swirling with a fierce, possessive promise. "Never," he vowed. He kissed her again, slower this time, deeper. It was a seal on their conspiracy, a promise that whatever darkness was coming for them, whatever plot was unraveling in the shadows of the castle, they would face it together. The door was locked. The world outside was cold and hostile. But in the dim light of the office, amidst the smell of old books and danger, there was fire. Eventually, Draco pulled back, though he didn't step away. He kept his hands on her waist, his thumbs rubbing soothing circles against the fabric of her robes. He looked at her with a new expression, one of terrifying clarity. "If we're going to do this," he said, his voice dropping to that low, analytical tone she had come to admire, "we need to stop playing defense. We need to hunt." Hermione nodded, smoothing her hair, though her lips felt swollen and bruised. The auditor mentioned an anonymous tip. That means the saboteur is close, someone in the castle. "Someone who knows the schedule," Draco added. "Someone who had access to the books before the copying charm was cast. And someone who hates you enough to risk hurting a student just to see you fail," Hermione finished. Draco's expression darkened. "That narrows it down to half the wizarding world." "But only a few people are in Hogwarts," Hermione said. She hopped off the desk, her mind sharpening, the fog of desire clearing just enough to make room for strategy. "We need to check the access logs for the staff room. We need to trace the magical signature on the forged book." "And," Draco said, reaching out to take her hand, intertwining their fingers, "we need to do it without killing anyone, which, given my current mood, will be the hardest part of the plan." Hermione squeezed his hand. I'll handle the ethics. You handle the execution." "A dangerous combination, Professor Granger," he smirked, though the shadow of fear still lingered in his eyes. "The best kind," she replied. They walked to the door together. Hermione unlocked it with a wave of her wand. As they stepped out into the corridor, the castle no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a battlefield. And for the first time since the war ended, Hermione Granger didn't feel like she was fighting alone. She looked at the man beside her, the former enemy, the accomplice, the lover, and knew that whatever happened next, the rules had changed. The unwritten laws of magic stated that light and dark could not mix. But as they walked shoulder to shoulder into the gloom, Hermione thought that perhaps the laws were wrong. Perhaps it was in the grey, in the messy, chaotic middle, where the real magic happened. The castle slept, a leviathan of stone slumbering beneath the relentless Scottish rain. But the tower room was awake with the frantic, hushed energy of conspiracy. Hermione Granger's private quarters were exactly as Draco had imagined them, a chaotic sanctuary of intellect. Books were not just shelved, they were architectural features. Stacks of leather-bound tomes formed unstable pillars near the hearth. Scrolls were draped over the chintz armchairs like throws, and the air smelled intensely of lavender tea, beeswax, and the sharp, metallic tang of revealing ink. It was 3 in the morning. The fire in the grate had burned down to glowing embers, casting long, wavering shadows across the rug where they sat. They were on the floor. The desk was too formal, too distant for the work they were doing. Between them lay the forged textbook, open to the damning page, surrounded by a constellation of star charts, staff rotors, and scraps of parchment covered in Draco's jagged scrawl and Hermione's neat, loop-heavy script. "It's not a standard concealment charm," Draco murmured, rubbing his eyes with the heel of his hand. He had discarded his jacket hours ago. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to reveal the pale skin of his forearms. "I've tried Revelio, Apparatium, and even a subtle dark detector. The ink absorbs the magic. It's feeding on the scrutiny." Hermione sat cross-legged opposite him, her hair a wild halo of curls in the firelight. She held her wand loosely, staring at the text until her vision blurred. "It's adaptive," she whispered. "That's high-level alchemy. Who do we know with that kind of skill set? Slughorn is too lazy. Flitwick wouldn't hurt a fly." "Maybe it's not a teacher," Draco said, picking up a quill and twirling it, a nervous habit she had come to find endearing. "Maybe it's a student, a prodigy. A student who knows the password to the staff archive and the revision schedule." Hermione shook her head. "No, this is personal. This is someone who knows us." She reached for the teapot, pouring the dregs of the lukewarm Earl Grey into 2 chipped mugs. Their fingers brushed as she handed him one. The contact was no longer electric. It was grounding. It was a reminder that in this terrifying mess, they were tethered to each other. Draco took the mug, wrapping his long fingers around the ceramic warmth. He didn't drink. He looked at her over the rim, his grey eyes dark with exhaustion and something else, a heavy, suffocating guilt that seemed to grow as the night wore on. "You should sleep," he said quietly. "You have a lecture in 5 hours." "I can't sleep," Hermione replied, taking a sip. "Every time I close my eyes, I see Rose choking. If we hadn't been there, if you hadn't cut the curse." "But I was there," Draco said, his voice hard. Because I'm the one who attracts this kind of rot, Hermione. You know it. He set the mug down with a sharp clack. The silence that followed was thick, filled with the unspoken fears that had been stalking them since they left Vane's office. This isn't just about the syllabus, Draco said, staring into the dying fire. The person who did this, they didn't just want to hurt a student. They wanted to prove a point. They wanted to prove that anything I touch turns to ash. He looked down at his left arm. The dark mark was faded, a silver scar against the pale skin, but to him it clearly still burned. Draco! Hermione started, leaning forward. Don't! He cut her off, his voice rough. Don't give me the Gryffindor speech about redemption. Look at the evidence, Granger. You're the smartest witch of your age. Use your logic. Since I came here, your class has been sabotaged, a student has been hospitalized, and you have a reprimand on your file that will never go away. He looked up at her, his expression raw, stripped of all his usual aristocratic armor. He looked broken. I am a containment breach, he whispered. I am a walking hazard. Vane was right. You should have let them take me. You're destroying your life trying to fix mine. Hermione felt a crack in her own chest. She saw the depth of his self-loathing, a pit so deep she wasn't sure he could ever climb out of it alone. He truly believed he was poison. She set her mug down and moved. She didn't crawl. She shifted, closing the small distance between them until her knees bumped against his. She reached out and took his hands, both of them, pulling them away from the protective knot he had tied them in. Look at me, she commanded softly. He resisted for a moment, then lifted his gaze. You think you're the only one who's broken? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. You think you're the only one who's tired? Draco frowned, confused. You're Hermione Granger. You won. You're perfect. I am exhausted, she confessed, the words tumbling out on a sigh that felt like a collapse. I have been perfect since I was 11 years old, Draco. I have been the responsible one, the one with the plan, the one who keeps everyone alive. I carried the tent. I brewed the potions. I erased my parents' memories to save them, and they still don't know who I am. The admission hung in the air, stark and painful. Draco's eyes widened. He hadn't known. I am so tired of being the moral compass, she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. I am tired of everyone looking at me and seeing a statue, a hero. She squeezed his hands, her grip fierce. But when you look at me, you don't see the hero. You see the know-it-all. You see the girl who's bossy and obsessive and messy. You argue with me. You challenge me. You make me feel human. Draco stared at her, stunned. He turned his hands over in hers, interlacing their fingers, holding on as if she were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. You are human, he said hoarsely. You are the most terrifyingly human person I have ever met. Then let me be human, she pleaded softly. Let me make mistakes. Let me risk my career for something I actually want, rather than what I'm supposed to do. I didn't save you because I'm a savior, Draco. I saved you because I don't want to be here without you. The walls of the tower room seemed to shrink, wrapping around them in a cocoon of candlelight and shadow. The investigation, the forged book, the ministry, it all faded into the background. There was only the heat of his hands, the scent of rain on his skin, and the undeniable gravitational pull between two lonely stars. Draco let out a breath that sounded like a surrender. He freed one hand and reached up, his fingers trailing down the side of her face, tracing the line of her jaw, the pulse fluttering in her throat. "I don't deserve you," he murmured, leaning in. "I know," she smiled, a wet, teary smile. "But I'm keeping you anyway." He kissed her then. It wasn't like the kiss in the office, frantic and desperate. This was slow. It was a question and an answer. It was a reverence. He kissed her as if she was something holy, something fragile that he was terrified to break, but unable to stop touching. Hermione sighed into his mouth, her hands moving up to tangle in the soft hair at the nape of his neck. She pulled him closer until there was no space left, until the buttons of his shirt pressed into her chest. She felt the tension drain out of him, replaced by a heavy, languid heat. They shifted, limbs tangling on the rug. Draco lay back, pulling her down with him, so she was draped over him, her hair creating a curtain that shut out the rest of the world. For a long time, there were no words. Only the sound of the rain against the glass, the crackle of the fire, and the soft, ragged sounds of two people finding solace in the wreckage of their pasts. It was a reclaiming. He was reclaiming his ability to touch without hurting. She was reclaiming her right to be vulnerable without falling. After a while, Hermione rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady thrum of his heart. His arm was wrapped tight around her waist, his chin resting on the top of her head. She stared idly at the scattered papers on the floor, her mind drifting in the pleasant haze of the aftermath. Her eyes landed on the forged textbook again. The firelight caught the edge of the page, illuminating a faint, glittering smudge she hadn't noticed before. She blinked. She sat up slightly, squinting. "What?" Draco murmured, his voice thick with sleepiness. "If you're going to tell me we missed a comma, I'm going to resign." "No," Hermione said, pulling away from him to crawl toward the book. "Draco, look at the ink smear, the one near the spine." Draco groaned, but sat up, leaning over her shoulder. His warm breath ghosted against her ear. "It's a smudge, Granger. Probably from when you slammed it shut in a rage." "No," she insisted. She grabbed her wand. "Lumos." Under the direct light, the smudge shimmered. It wasn't black ink. It was iridescent, purple and gold. "That's not ink," Hermione breathed. "That's residue. Magical residue from a joke product." Draco stiffened. "A joke product?" "The Weasley's Wheezes line," Hermione said, her mind racing, connecting dots with the speed of a lightning strike. "They developed a line of invisible ink for the cheat in you. It uses Demiguy's hair extract. That's why the revealing charms didn't work. It's not dark magic concealment. It's invisibility components." Draco stared at the smudge. "Wait, you're telling me the person who forged a dark curse into a textbook used prank ink?" "It fits," Hermione said, turning to him, her eyes wide. "The alteration to the syllabus. It wasn't meant to kill Rose. It was meant to cause chaos. A prank that went wrong. The ink masked the intent, but the spell twisted because the ink itself is unstable when mixed with serious binding magic." "Who has access to high-end Weasley products and the staff room?" Draco asked, his voice sharpening. Hermione looked at the staff list on the floor. Her finger traced down the names. Flitwick, Sprout, McGonagall. Then she stopped. "The new caretaker," she whispered. "Filch retired last year. The new one, He's young. He was a student during the war. He didn't graduate. Pringle? Draco frowned. The one who's always complaining about the students making messes. No, Hermione said. Not Pringle. The assistant. The one who stocks the supplies. The one who brings the new textbooks up from the delivery carriage. She grabbed a piece of parchment from the pile, a delivery manifest for the term's supplies. Signed D. Creevy, she read. Draco froze. Creevy? As in, the boy with the camera, the one who died? His younger brother, Hermione said, her voice hollow. Dennis Creevy works in the castle supply. Draco sat back, his face pale in the firelight. Dennis Creevy. He was in the DA, wasn't he? He fought in the battle. He was tiny, Hermione remembered, her heart aching. He idolized Harry. He hated everything associated with the Death Eaters. He hates me, Draco said softly. He sees me teaching here. He sees me rehabilitated. And he decides to play a prank, to sabotage my class, to make me look incompetent. He probably bought the enchanted quill to change the text, thinking it would just make the ropes fall down or turn into snakes, Hermione theorized. He didn't know enough about magical theory to realize that breaking the loop on an incarcerous diagram turns it into a strangulation hex. Ignorance, Draco murmured. Not malice, just reckless, stupid hate. He looked at Hermione. The mystery was solved. The monster in the shadows wasn't a dark wizard plotting the return of Voldemort. It was a grieving boy with a prank quill and a grudge. We have him, Draco said. We can go to McGonagall. We can prove it wasn't us. We can. Hermione nodded, but she didn't move. She looked at Draco sitting on her rug in the middle of the night, his hair messy, his shirt undone, looking more alive than he had in years. If we turn him in, Hermione said quietly, he'll go to Azkaban, tampering with educational materials, causing bodily harm to a student. Even if it was accidental, the Ministry won't care. He's an adult now. Draco looked at the fire. She saw the conflict in his eyes. He, of all people, knew what Azkaban did to a person. He, of all people, knew what it was like to make a terrible mistake because you were young and angry and didn't understand the consequences. He almost killed a girl, Draco said. And you almost killed Dumbledore, Hermione countered gently. Draco flinched. He looked at her, searching her face. What are you saying, Granger? I'm saying, she whispered, reaching out to touch his knee, that we have a choice. We can be the law, or we can be teachers. Draco let out a long, slow breath. He covered her hand with his own. He looked at the forged book, then at the door, and finally back at her. The grey in his eyes softened, melting into something like hope. The sun is coming up, he said, nodding toward the window where the sky was turning a bruised shade of violet. We have a class to prepare. We do, she agreed. I suppose, Draco drawled, a faint, tired smirk touching his lips, that if we are going to confront a saboteur, we should probably put our clothes back on first. Hermione laughed, a bright, clear sound that chased the shadows out of the corners of the room. Probably for the best. She stood up, offering him a hand. He took it, pulling himself up. For a moment they stood there, chest to chest, the night's revelations hanging between them. They were tired, they were compromised, and they were in deep trouble. But as Draco leaned down to kiss her forehead, Hermione knew one thing for certain. They were no longer just survivors of a war. They were builders of a future, and they were going to build it their way. The dawn did not break. It bled slowly into the sky, bruising the horizon with streaks of violet and cold, pale gold. The supply room, located in the labyrinthine depths of the dungeons, smelled of sawdust, cardboard, and the stale, lingering scent of preservation potions. Dennis Creevy stood by a stack of parchment, his back to the door. He was sorting quills into boxes, his movements jerky and agitated. He looked older than the boy Hermione remembered from the DA, his face thinner, the youthful enthusiasm carved away by grief. When the door creaked open, he jumped, dropping a box. Quills scattered across the stone floor like spilled needles. "Clumsy," a voice drawled from the shadows. Dennis spun around. His eyes widened as they landed on Draco Malfoy, who was leaning casually against the doorframe, arms crossed, looking for all the world like the predator the rumors claimed he was. Beside him stood Hermione Granger, her expression unreadable, holding a thick black textbook. "Professor Malfoy," Dennis stammered, his hand instinctively going to his pocket where his wand was stashed. "Professor Granger, I was just inventorying the new shipment." "We're not here for the inventory, Dennis," Hermione said softly. She stepped into the room, the hem of her robe sweeping over the scattered quills. She placed the book on a crate between them. "We're here for the edit." Dennis looked at the book. His throat bobbed. "I don't know what you mean." "The Demiguise ink," Draco said, pushing off the wall. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The silence of the dungeon amplified every syllable. "Clever, expensive, hard to trace, but not impossible if you know what you're looking for." "I didn't," Dennis started, but his voice cracked. He looked at Draco with a sudden, surging hatred that transformed his fearful face. "I didn't do anything wrong. I was just fixing it." "Fixing it?" Hermione asked, her brow furrowing. "He shouldn't be here," Dennis shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Draco. "He let them into the castle. He watched my brother die. And now he gets to teach. He gets to stand there in a suit and act like he's an expert on ethics. It's a joke. It's all a sick joke." Draco didn't flinch. He didn't sneer. He stood perfectly still, letting the boy's anger wash over him like a tide. "So, you decided to make me look incompetent," Draco said quietly. "You bought a prank quill. You altered the diagrams. You thought if the students failed, if the magic went wrong, the ministry would finally see me for what I am and drag me away." "You belong in Azkaban," Dennis spat, tears welling in his eyes. "Maybe," Draco agreed. The single word sucked the air out of the room. Dennis blinked, thrown off balance. Draco took a step forward. He moved slowly, his hands visible and empty. "But Rose Zeller doesn't belong in the hospital wing." Dennis went pale. "Rose? What? What happened to Rose?" "The spell you altered," Hermione interjected, her voice sharp with the reality of the situation. "The broken loop. It turned a binding jinx into a strangulation hex. She was nearly crushed to death yesterday, Dennis." Dennis staggered back, hitting the shelving unit. A jar of beetle eyes rattled ominously. No, it was just supposed to make the ropes fall down. It was supposed to be funny, to make him look like a bad teacher." "Magic doesn't care about your joke," Draco said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "And it doesn't care about your grief. You changed the intent. You introduced chaos into a controlled environment. You almost became a murderer." Dennis slid down the shelf, burying his face in his hands. Sobs racked his small frame, ugly, jagged sounds of guilt and terror. I didn't mean to. I just wanted it to be fair. Hermione looked at the weeping man, then at Draco. She saw the tension in Draco's jaw, the way he was looking at Dennis, not with malice, but with a dark, mirror-like recognition. He saw himself. He saw the boy who had been given a task too big for him, driven by anger and fear, making choices that would haunt him forever. Hermione waited. She knew, with a sudden clarity, that this was Draco's test. Not the Ministry's test, but his own. Draco sighed. He walked over to Dennis and crouched down, ignoring the dust on his tailored trousers. "Get up," Draco said. Dennis looked up, his eyes red and swollen. "If we report this," Draco said, his voice void of emotion, "you go to Azkaban, assault on a student, tampering with Ministry property, 5 years minimum." Dennis flinched. "But," Draco continued, "Professor Granger and I are tired of filling out paperwork, and frankly, the Ministry doesn't need another tragedy." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy pouch of galleons, his consulting fee for the month. He dropped it into Dennis's lap. "Leave," Draco said. "What?" Dennis whispered. "Resign. Today. Cite family issues. Take the boat to the mainland and don't come back to Hogwarts," Draco ordered. "Go somewhere new, somewhere nobody knows the name Creevy or Malfoy. Start over." "You're letting me go?" "I'm banishing you," Draco corrected sharply. He stood up, towering over the boy. "Because I know what it's like to make a mistake that almost kills someone. And I know that living with the guilt is a punishment far worse than a cell." He turned his back on Dennis. "You have 1 hour. If you're still in the castle after breakfast, I hand the book to the Aurors." Dennis scrambled up, clutching the gold. He looked at Hermione, then at Draco's back. "Why?" "Because the war is over," Hermione said softly. "Go, Dennis." He ran. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing like a final gavel stroke. Hermione let out a long breath, leaning against the crate. She looked at Draco. He was staring at the empty doorway, his shoulders slightly slumped. "That was reckless," she said, though a small smile played on her lips. "It was efficient," he countered, turning to face her. The mask was back in place, but his eyes were warm. "And Vane is waiting." "What's the lie, Granger?" "Manufacturing defect," Hermione said promptly. "A bad batch of printing ink that reacted with the castle's wards. We confiscated the books, burned them for safety, and have requested a new, clean shipment." "Boring," Draco critiqued. "But plausible. Vane will love it. It involves paperwork and no scandal." "Exactly." She walked over to him, reaching out to straighten his collar. The gesture was domestic, intimate, and startlingly natural. "You were good just now." "I was soft," he muttered, looking away. "My father would be appalled." "Good," Hermione whispered. She stood on her tiptoes and pressed a quick, firm kiss to his cheek. "Let's go finish this." The final lecture of the Ethics of Post-War Magic course took place 3 days later. The Great Hall had been converted into a dueling stage for the final demonstration. Sunlight poured through the enchanted ceiling, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The students were lined up, wands at the ready. They looked different than they had in September, less fearful, more disciplined. They stood with their feet apart, their grips steady. Hermione stood at the head of the room, her voice projecting clearly. "The final exam is simple. You will face an opponent. You will disarm them, and then you will secure them. But, she paused, her eyes scanning the faces of the young witches and wizards, you will do it without malice. You will do it because it is necessary, not because you enjoy it. And, Draco's voice cut in as he stepped up beside her, if you hesitate, you fail. Mercy is not hesitation. Mercy is a choice you make after you have won. He looked at the class. Begin. The room erupted in flashes of red and white light. Expelliarmus! Incarcerus! Hermione watched them. She watched Rose Zeller perfectly disarm a Slytherin boy, then catch his wand before it hit the ground, handing it back to him with a nod. She watched the Boot brothers working in tandem, covering each other's blind spots. They were learning, not just how to fight, but how to be. They aren't terrible, Draco murmured, leaning in close to her ear so only she could hear. High praise, coming from you. Hermione smiled, not taking her eyes off the students. Don't let it go to your head. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a united front against the chaos. The tension that had defined their relationship for so long, the seesaw of approach and repulsion, had settled into a steady, humming frequency. It wasn't that the differences between them had disappeared. It was that they had learned to harmonize them. As the bell rang, signaling the end of the term, the students didn't bolt. They lingered. A few approached the dais. Professor Malfoy, Rose Zeller asked shyly, will you be back next term for the advanced course? Draco hesitated. He looked at Hermione. The inquiry from the ministry was still pending, technically, though Vane had accepted their report on the defective ink. His probation was up for review. Hermione looked at him. Her eyes were steady, brown and bright, and full of that terrifying, wonderful faith. I believe, Draco said slowly, turning back to the girl, that Professor Granger and I have a lot more work to do. Yes, I'll be here. Rose beamed and ran off to join her friends. The hall emptied slowly until only the two of them were left. The silence was peaceful, filled with the echo of laughter and the smell of ozone. So, Hermione said, stacking her notes, another term. It appears so. Draco picked up his wand, twirling it idly. I suppose this means we have to rewrite the syllabus again, since the last one tried to kill everyone. I have some ideas, Hermione said, clutching her books to her chest. I was thinking we could introduce a unit on the ethics of forgiveness. Sounds dreadful, Draco smirked. I was thinking advanced hexes for people who annoy you. Compromise, she offered. Always, he agreed. They walked out of the great hall together, stepping into the cool, bright afternoon. The grounds were green and vibrant, the black lake glittering like a sheet of hammered silver in the distance. As they walked down the stone steps toward the lake, leaving the castle behind them, Draco's hand brushed against hers. It wasn't an accident. He hooked his pinky finger around hers, a small, secret anchor. You know, he said, staring straight ahead, his profile sharp against the sky. They're going to talk, the students, the staff, the prophet. Let them talk, Hermione said, tightening her grip on his finger. I've read the books, Draco. I know how the story ends. Oh? He glanced at her, an eyebrow raised. And how does it end? Hermione stopped. She turned to face him, the wind catching her hair, blowing it across her face. She felt light. She felt free. She looked at the man who had been her enemy, her rival, her headache, and her savior. It doesn't, she said, smiling. That's the best part. It's just the beginning. Draco stared at her for a moment, and then a genuine laugh escaped him, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. He shook his head, looking at the ground, then back up at the sun. "The beginning," he echoed. "I can work with that." He offered her his arm, formal and old-fashioned. "Shall we, Professor Granger?" Hermione took it. "We shall, Professor Malfoy." They walked on toward the water, two silhouettes against the vast open horizon, writing their own laws of magic, one step at a time. The war was history. The lesson was over. But the love story, messy, complicated, and entirely theirs, was just starting to get interesting.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for listening to the Unwriting Law of the Magic. I love writing this story because it's not just about romance, it is about healing. We usually think that Hermione is perfect and the Draco is a villain, but in this story I wanted to show the truth. They are both just a human, they are both tired from the war, and they are both lonely. The most important idea here is that the world is not black and white. Sometimes good people make mistakes. Sometimes broken people can save you. Draco and Hermione found safety in each other. They didn't fix the past, but they decided to build a future. I hope the story made you feel something special today. Remember, sometimes the person you fight with is the only one who truly understands you. Thank you for being here with me. See you in the next story.